Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. We're going to wait a few more minutes for everyone to join, but please feel free to put your name and where you're joining from in the comments. We'd love to know who's with us in this space tonight, and we'll get started in just a moment or two when more people have the chance to join. And although I'll introduce myself officially in a little bit, I'll say, by way of kicking off the comments, that my name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, and I'm joining you all tonight from Chicago, Illinois. And I'd love to hear where you're all from. Oh, wow, we already have a big range of time zones. I'm excited to see people from, really from everywhere. We have Oregon, we have Indiana, we have Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey. I'm from northern New Jersey. That's exciting. So please, everyone, as you're coming on, please introduce yourself. I see someone else from Chicago. We'd love to see where you're from, see your name on there. Please do say hi so we can get a sense of who's in the room. And we'll start in just a minute when everyone or close to everyone is on. We have around 1,500 people signed up for tonight's event. So I do want to give a moment for everyone to join, and then I'll introduce myself more officially and introduce our speaker as well. So please keep introducing yourselves. If you have questions, those can go in the comments also. And we'd love to hear your virtual voices as we're getting started. Okay, wonderful. We have people from really all over the country and also other countries. Hello from Brazil, that's fun. So we're excited to have you all. I did see a question about closed captioning, so I'm passing that on to our admins tonight. And in the meantime, we'll get started. And it's just about, well, I'm in Chicago. It's 7 o'clock here. It's whatever time it is, in whatever time zone you're in, but I'm excited to welcome you all. My name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, and I'm really excited to see so many of you here tonight. This is a really exciting event for Sefaria. One part of my role as Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria is working to add new texts and additional translations to Sefaria's constantly growing library. And I know I speak for all of my colleagues at Sefaria when I say that we feel so lucky to be working every day to make Torah more accessible to a larger audience. And of course, one of the most important aspects of making Torah more accessible is adding excellent translations of texts that are in the original. So with that in mind, we were very excited to be able to add the translation of Professor Everett Fox to Sefaria's library, to be able to add that Torah translation. It's a really, really exciting addition. I was mentioning to Professor Fox before we got started, given the kinds of texts that we add on Sefaria, we don't always have the opportunity to speak to the authors. And so it's really exciting when we have an author of one of our texts available to speak. And that's the opportunity that we have tonight. So I'm really honored to be in conversation with Professor Fox this evening and to invite him to speak a little bit about language performance and translating the Bible. So really to talk about the art of translation, the impact of his work. We'll talk a little bit about the importance and impact of translations more generally and the significance of having his monumental work available on Sefaria. By way of introduction, although I expect that many of you here already know of Professor Fox or are already familiar with his work, Professor Fox is the Alan M. Glick Professor of Judaics and Biblical Studies at Clark University. He is the author of a number of works, including the 5 Books of Moses, a New English translation with commentary and notes, which is the work that we have been privileged to add to Sefaria. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Fox to all of you this evening.
Nice to meet you all. One slight correction, I'm not the author, I'm only the translator.
Only the translator. Okay, fair enough. I
Just
guess
so
that's
we're,
a caveat if you're
so
the
we're
translator.
clear about that.
Right, so it's one of those books where, you either do or don't get to meet the author, but you're the translator of this very important text. And I'd like to start off by asking you to reflect a little bit on when you started thinking of yourself as a translator. Are there specific challenges for a biblical translator as opposed to other forms of literature? How did you kind of shape yourself into this role, and how do you think about it?
Well, I would say that I certainly did not set out to be a Bible translator. That's something that happened over time. As a senior at Brandeis, I had studied with Nachum Glotzer, who himself had studied with Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig in Germany. They had done very groundbreaking and unusual translation into German. Wasn't known that well outside of Germany, at least I thought it was not. And so when I discovered it in the library, I was quite astonished to see what it was. It really made me rethink everything I knew about the Bible in terms of how it presented itself, in terms of how it read, uh, poetic lines, and so on. And that really sent me back to the Hebrew, um, especially biblical Hebrew grammar. So I thought I would try and see what it would look like in English, and I really started with one chapter, the Akedah, Genesis 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac. I had in the back of my mind the idea that I didn't want to see the Buber Rosenzweig translation disappear from history, so I thought maybe I could do something in that vein, maybe even Genesis. I'm not sure I had thought of the whole thing yet. I did this chapter, gave it to a learned friend of mine, feeling that it was pretty good. He didn't understand a word. So there was clearly more work to be done. But as I started to work through Genesis, I became pretty exhilarated. This was something of a challenge, but it spoke to sort of two sides of myself, one, the scholarly side, and the other, the more artistic side. And I think it's that combination that started to attract me. I did a translation of Genesis, first in Response magazine, and then some years later in print. But at that point, that's really all I had thought about. I did want to share some of the unusual aspects of the translation, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. Um, but this is something that, in a way, crept up on me, and I kind of found my own voice, and it coincided with a lot of other things I was doing. I was reading a lot of Kafka. I was reading Rosenzweig's letters. I was working on Hebrew grammar. Somehow it all came together. The difficulty was partly that this was not where biblical scholarship was, at least in the 60s. It took a while to come around to looking at the Bible through more literary eyes, and so that took a while to come to fruition. But once I was into it, I was really hooked. And as things expanded into Shemot, into Exodus, then it picked up its own momentum. Um, so that's the initial story. I was young. I never would have contemplated translating the Torah as a goal at the beginning, but it's something that I somehow got into. I realized that the JPS translation, which had come out in '62, had its virtues, but it missed a lot of what the Hebrew has to offer in terms of word plays and puns and structure and rhythm. Um, so that too became something important to try and demonstrate. What I really wanted to do was, in a way, to give the reader a jolt. I wouldn't say shock the reader, but I would say to give a jolt, to move towards the idea that you're looking at a classic, at something that people know, but you're looking at it as something new, that you're hearing and seeing things that you didn't see before. And, we all have this experience in theater and in music, a performance that somehow wakes us up. And I think that was very much on my mind as this evolved.
One of the things that I've noticed from my vantage point at Sefaria as a not someone who's a translator, but someone who curates translations, that we're always putting up more and more translations on the site, is that people are very sensitive to translations. So we not infrequently get emails or notes saying, you've translated this incorrectly. And of course, it's rare, or it's never happened that we say, oh yes, that's actually an incorrect translation, right? Let's take that down. It's more often the case that Sefaria offers multiple translations, and different translators are putting out different visions and trying to accomplish different things. So can you talk a little bit more about beyond this idea of sort of jolting the reader, but what specifically were you trying to achieve in creating your translation of the Torah? What did you see as a sort of unique offering of this translation?
Yeah, I really was trying to give the reader a sense of some of the things that the Hebrew does with language, and some of the internal ways that it works. That is to say, allusion. You read a sentence and it reminds you of something earlier in the story, or even in another book, and that kind of intertextuality, if you want to call it that, is all over the Bible, especially in the Torah. Things are always referring to other things, and characters are always using language reminding you of something else, or an earlier character. And that's usually not possible in translation. So there are many, many examples of this kind of thing. I can give you one
Yeah, do you
offhand.
have a favorite or two?
Sure, sure. In the Jacob stories, the stories about Yaakov in Genesis, um, when he steals the blessing from his brother through deceiving his blind father, and Yaakov leaves, Esav comes in and finds out that he's been tricked. And of course, the father finds out he's been tricked as well. And he tells his elder son, your brother came with deceit and took away your blessing. And Esav says, he's sneaked on me now. First he took away my firstborn right, and now he's taken my blessing. Well, later on in the Yaakov stories, when he is looking for a wife, or two or three or four, he falls in love with Rachel, works for her for 7 years, and then, in famous story, he's given the wrong sister. Presumably he's quite drunk and it's dark. Well, he wakes up the next morning, and of course it's Leah. One of the great moments in the Bible, instead of painting a scene that takes a page, it just says Hine Leah, here she was Leah. That's all you need to know. Anyway, he goes to Lavan, his tricky uncle, and says, why have you deceived me? Lama zerim mitani. And the uncle says, well, that's not the way we do things around here. We don't marry off the younger before, not the elder, but the firstborn. So if you look at the vocabulary and you listen to the text, Yaakov had stolen the blessing with words like deceit and firstborn right, and then he gets the tables turned on him, and he is deceived and given the firstborn instead of the younger wife. Now, the text seems to be making that connection. Very often these things are isolated that way. If you don't pay attention to that, and you just translate, we give the elder before the younger, it's not incorrect, but you've missed the connection. Mm-hmm. Another example I would give, famous example, when God first appears to Avraham, He says lech lecha, something like go you forth. And then in the Akedah story, isolated is the same phrase once again, lech lecha. And it seems that we are meant to connect those two stories as a kind of bracket of his life. The rabbis talk about the tests that he undergoes. Most translations will not necessarily reflect that. So JPS, for instance, has go forth the first time and go the second time. Not a bad translation, but missing the connection. And it's these kinds of internal connections that the Torah loves to use all the time. And you can connect themes, motifs, and it feels to me like clues. We're given hints and clues. We are asked to be an active audience, not a passive one. So, whenever I can try and hint at or even reproduce something like that, I jump on it because it's, in my view, it's really important. And to miss it is to really lose something in the text.
Those are both great examples, and I think do such a good job of illustrating what makes your translation so exciting. I'll say that we're getting a lot of questions in the comments, and we will take questions officially at the end, so you're all welcome to keep those questions coming. But just as a quick follow-up to that point, a few people have already asked questions about kind of how you select the correct translation or the most correct translation, which you spoke to a little bit, and also the question of consistency. Right? Do you always translate, or when do you choose to translate the word in the same way, like the Lech Lecha example, and when do you choose to translate it differently? So those are both just.
I will translate it the same way. It's an important question. I'll translate it the same way if I think that the text is trying to emphasize that as a theme. I mean, we could talk about it at greater length, but in the Moshe story, the early Moses stories of his birth and his early career, I guess you could say, the root resh aleph hey to see is really important. Now in English, especially if you're in grade school, you write a composition. If you use see all the time, you're going to get it marked up. Teacher is going to want you to say look at or gaze or something like that. But in that case, it's such an important theme word for various reasons that I'll keep it. On the other hand, if it doesn't matter, and if it's more accurate to have a varied translation for a term, I'll do that. So it really is, it's a judgment call, as if I think that there's something thematically important. But it is a choice, and it sometimes results in some awkwardness, which is a price that I'm willing to pay that many translators are not.
Thank you. You mentioned the sort of mimicking the feel of the Hebrew or the sounds of the Hebrew a little bit when you first started speaking. Can you talk a little bit about what it feels like for you when you hear your translation read aloud? Actually, I noticed that there was at least one comment so far about the kind of transformative nature of reading your translation out loud. And so the relationship between translation and performance is something you've written about, something you've spoken about. So
Right.
you reflect a little bit on that.
Well, the reading out loud is extremely important. And I was alerted to that, not so much in translation, but of course in the original. I've written about this many years ago. I was a teenager, so yeah, it's many years ago. I was given a record. You remember records? They're these big vinyl things. And Abba Eban, who at the time I think was the foreign minister of Israel, made a recording in his beautiful Cambridge English and in Hebrew of excerpts from Psalms and Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. And since he was trained in Middle Eastern languages, the way he read the Hebrew, except for the English accent, was extremely grammatical and extremely rhythmic. And that really, that was a jolt to me to realize that it could be read that way, slower than people would read it today, I'm sure. And the grammar and the signals in the text brings out meaning and connections once again. Now, it depends on who reads it. Just after the Torah translation appeared in 1995, there was an event, a December celebration in New York called Bible Live. And I was lucky enough that the opening lines of Genesis were read by James Earl Jones. He did it differently than I would have done, but of course, wonderfully anyway. But as I say, one has to really be taught to read the Bible slowly and thoughtfully. Charles Laughton, the great actor of the first half of the 20th century, used to do one-man shows, and he would always read something from the Bible, and it's quite astounding. So the rhetoric, the way that the text sounds, it's really important. I'll give you quick example of what I mean. The first verses of Genesis 2, which are really the ending of the creation story, almost always printed as a paragraph. We chanted on Friday nights over Kiddush, but the Hebrew has its own rhythm, and this is what I tried to do with it. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth with all of their array. God had finished on the seventh day his work that he had made, and then he ceased on the seventh day from all his work that he had made. God blessed the seventh day, and he hallowed it, for on it he ceased from all his work that by creating God had made. Well, that's a poem. That's not a paragraph of prose. And very often sections in the Bible end with a poem. It seems to be a favorite thing to do. Well, if you read the Hebrew, you will hear those rhythms. And I was trying to gently, or maybe not so gently, nudge the reader toward the Hebrew. That's really the goal here. Rosenzweig was fond of quoting a famous translator of the Iliad into German, who began his book, "Dear reader, learn Greek and throw my translation into the fire." I don't like to think about book burnings these days, so I'll pass on that, but you get the idea. And performance means also catching the emotional temperature of what one is reading. Recently, my colleague Ed Greenstein, who's emeritus at Bar Ilan, finished his decades-long work on the book of Job, and he tried to use some of the same principles. So when Job begins his harangue in chapter 3, most translations end the sentences in periods. It's very tame. Greenstein puts in something like 13 exclamation points in the first 8 or 9 verses. So instead of saying, let the day perish when I was born, comes out as, let the day disappear the day I was born, and the night that announced a man's been conceived. And it starts to sound like King Lear, because the emotion is so high. And we don't always associate that with the Bible. Even when the Torah is read, or when the Haftarot are chanted, something like the Haftarah for Yom Kippur, right? It's been somehow tamed by being put in the Machzor, but if you really look at that Haftarah, it really should be shouted or even screamed. Of course, Isaiah would then be escorted out of the shul, but that's another problem.
I'm glad you brought up the idea or the question of performative readings, ritual readings of the Torah, because I think that is a really different way to experience Torah, right? The scroll technology is really different than the book technology, even in terms of, right, the exclamation points that you're advocating for wouldn't even show up in a Torah scroll where we don't have that kind of punctuation.
Well, that of course is the challenge. I mean, I years ago, I was given the honor to read the creation story. It was on Simchat Torah, and in a minyan where they allowed me to read it instead of chant it. And I remember having goosebumps. No periods, no commas, no exclamation points, no quotation marks, but just, of course, the letters, and no little numbers. And the challenge was to take that and to bring it to life. But it was quite the experience, I would say. You know,
That sounds like its own
where
translation.
are you? How do you read that? And we're unfortunately we're sometimes lulled into complacency by the trope. We have this tradition of the notes, uh, but where is the line between the notes and the emotion? There are not that many Torah readers out there who really have mastered both. But maybe we'll get back to that.
Well, so thinking some more about the difference between reading from, let's say, a Torah scroll, no punctuation, not even the cancellation, which is just memorized, as opposed to a book like yours with extensive notes and punctuation and all the pieces that give us cues for how we might perform it if we were going to. I'm curious how you see today's technologies, digital
Mhm.
technology, for example, changing people's relationship with the Torah as text. And really, I'm curious if you have advice for the next generation of translators. I know a few people already mentioned the need to keep translating. So I'm curious about the interplay between technology and the future of translation.
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about that. I do want to say one last thing about what we were just talking about, which was the first thing I published also in Response Magazine was the Akedah, and I did not use any punctuation there at all. And I actually prefer that because it forces the reader to supply it. Okay. Um, I was initially a little worried that today's technology might fragment the text on the screen. But the truth is that it does give us greater accessibility, and it especially gives us the tools to create learning materials. So the technology, of course, is wonderful for the classroom and for private study, and very exciting to see how Sefaria makes it possible to create all kinds of sheets and diagrams, and but also, of course, use the text. I'll also remind us that these historical bumps that take place always take a while to get used to. In rabbinic times, it was maybe only the worry that it would all get lost that pushed people to write down Mishnah, Talmud, even Bible. In the 15th century, people were worried similarly that the invention of movable type in Europe would cause memorization, which is so crucial to transmitting text, to fall by the wayside. Well, we got used to that. And it's long been noted that Judaism historically works through hypertexts, right? Cross references. So today, the mouse click replaces the use of multiple fingers on the page. Always makes me think of that game Twister, where you're kind of contorting yourself, right? You have one finger here, one finger there. But the technology now makes it possible, with a click to go through all kinds of stuff. So I think as people get used to it, it's a tremendous tool, and that's really important. What would I say to the next generation of translators? Um, First of all, I would say be prepared to accept defeat. If you're a perfectionist and with very little tolerance for losing, you're not going to make it. You have to be prepared and willing to have an open mind. You have to read the articles. If somebody finally figures out some difficult passage, use it, give credit. Um, the other thing I would say is, of course, to be conscientious and not to neglect the poetic and rhythmic aspects of the text. Here again, it's not just, well, some of it's poetry or some of it's poetic, and isn't that nice? It's very crucial. As we used to say in the 60s, the medium is the message. And the Bible says things the way it does for a reason, because it helps convey the meaning. Um, When you look, for instance, at the Shimshon story, the story of Samson, which of course is not in the Torah, but in what I've called the early prophets. That's my volume 2, soon to appear on Sefaria. Um, in the story of Samson and Delilah, she tries to find out the secret of his strength. And he keeps telling her, of course, the wrong thing. And when he does that, he says, "If you were to do this to me, I'd become weak like any other man." But the Hebrew is v'haliti v'hayiti ka'achad ha'adam. The rhythm makes you sit up and take notice. That happens a couple of times. And then finally, when he tells her the truth, he says, v'haliti v'hayiti kechol ha'adam, not like any man, like all men. And the implication is he's told her the truth this time, and she sees that he's told her all his heart. And once again, the rhythm tells us what's really going on in the story. So don't neglect the poetic and rhythmic aspect of these texts, even the narrative ones and even the legal ones. Take a look at Leviticus 11, the kashrut laws. It almost reads like a poem, which is absurd to think about when you're talking about hooves and chewing the cud, but there it is.
I'm really interested in those examples. What it raised for me, what it reminded me of is early on in Sefaria's history, when we had just begun the project of linking one text to another, we received a lot of questions about why different parts of the Bible weren't necessarily linked to each other. And the answer, in short, at that point was that those links weren't necessarily uh, able to be implemented algorithmically. So there's no like footnote in the Bible that tells you that, let's say, one story in Genesis is echoing another story in Genesis. It wasn't something that we could automate, and different people see different links in the text, exactly as you're
Sure,
saying. You can
sure.
read it and not be focused on it, sort of miss it. You could maybe lean into a connection, and someone else says, "No, I don't really think that connection is so
Yeah.
significant." I'm curious, would you want the technology to enhance that in some way? Would you want it to support that? Like where's the potential of new
Yeah,
technology?
well, what I've done, one of the things that Buber talked about a lot was what he called the leading word technique, where, like with this word to see in the Moses story, that it recurs a number of times and is trying to point to something. When I've done that in class, sometimes I've printed out a sheet where, the particular word is in bold. So that's a possibility, or in italics. I mean, if I'm marking it up by pencil, I circle, I underline. So one can do stuff like that. The Buber Rosenzweig translation had no footnotes or no notes on the page and no commentary. And it became clear to me very early on that to teach this kind of approach, it really needed to go that way. Some years ago, my wife and I started working, almost finished actually, Genesis for first readers and kids that would point out some of these things on the page or on a facing page. And I think that that's really important to do. My model, by the way, in that was something I learned in high school, which was the Folger Library Shakespeare, which had the play on the right uh, right or the left, and on the facing page had notes, illustrations, and so on. So on Sefaria, you just click on the asterisk, and there you've got the note. Um, and of course, there are people who in the tradition of Mikraot Gedolot, traditional page for studying the Bible, have different commentators on the same page. I'm sure that can be set up as well.
Yeah, I do want to go a little bit deeper into that conversation about what's possible on
Mhm.
Sefaria? I mean, you've mentioned a little bit about what excites you about having the translation on Sefaria, and I'd like to ask you to reflect on that a little bit more, and particularly in the context of having multiple translations. I already told you we get these critiques sometimes. Oh, you mistranslated this word. You have this wrong, and
Mhm.
we tell people, no, you can look at other translations, and in a moment I'll show everyone how to do that for anyone who doesn't know. But I'm
Sure.
curious what would you tell people about the value of that experience of having multiple translations? How do you think that enriches a reading experience, and anything else you want to say about the way you might advise people to read on Sefaria?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, one of the resources that I've used in the past in college classes has been a website called BibleGateway.com, ignoring the advertisements on the side. And they'll give you something like 30 different translations, not all of which are valuable, but they're interesting. And you can actually, if you print out a verse or you call up a verse, you can hit a key that has them all the translations of that verse on one page. So that's valuable in terms of giving you the range of meaning and, of course, different possibilities. And to me, that's analogous to different performances of a piece of music. I mean, you could study the score, you can study a performance. You're going to get different tempi. You're going to get you know different textures, orchestral textures, and so on. And so it's always valuable to hear how different people do it. Um, my work falls rather on one end of the spectrum, that is to say, toward a sort of more toward the Hebrew than toward the English. But I think it is valuable to see multiple possibilities. Obviously, if I thought that everybody else had solved all the problems, I wouldn't have gotten into this. But there is something to be said for switching and seeing what's lost and what's gained.
That's great.
Um,
I think that really speaks to Safaria's goal of, again, opening up access, and even just looking at the questions and comments that came in tonight, I can see
mm,
that people want to dig in some places about, why translate this word this way and why translate
sure.
this other word this other way. And so I'll just draw people's attention to, in the comments, um,
And
my colleague
here's
did.
something else. I mean, you asked me what excites me about having my translation on Sefaria. Well, for one thing, having the Hebrew there potentially is something that I haven't been able to do. My publisher was not willing to take on the expense and the incredibly thin pages that would have resulted. But that's not the only thing. What's one of the things that's really great for me and somebody like me is the ability to change the text easily. Um, you don't get to do this when in a printed book. If you're lucky, you have a second edition, but that can take years, and then you might still change your mind again. Uh, Translation is by nature a kind of plastic form, and again, if you use the analogy of performance, um, uh, an actor or a conductor or a pianist will change slightly or more from night to night. We don't get to do that. But Sefaria, in a way, makes that possible. I pick up the phone, I call Lev, and he promises that he'll, change this word, which is a big relief to me. And I'm always discovering something that I missed, or take an exclamation point away, or a misprint, or something that I just really got wrong, and I now realize needs to be changed. So that's that's for the translator. It's not only for the reader, but I would expect somebody to write me at some point and say, "Why did you change that?"
I think we already got some of those questions, but
I'm sure that's true.
but I'll just say briefly that, to kind of follow up on that point, and show what we've been talking about. Again, I think it's so important to realize that you can you can view multiple translations on Sefaria, and I wouldn't want people to feel that they're limited to one or the other. I think in part because, because of what you said, that seeing these multiple translations is something that really allows you to kind of appreciate the choices that are being made, and to see the different perspectives that might be there. And so, to give an example, let's see if I can share my screen for a moment. I just want to show you what that sheet it's being shared in the chat, but I want to show you for a moment what it looks like on Sefaria. So let's see.
And by the way, Nechama Leibovich does this all the time. It was one of her things in her wonderful works.
Yes, which we also have on Sefaria.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But I'll just show briefly that when you click on any text, and you mentioned translating Genesis, and we're about to get there in the Torah cycle, so I'll start there. And again, it's actually specifically on this verse, actually, where I think we get the most feedback. I'll put it neutrally, that Bereshit bara Elokim and Hashemayim v'haaretz is a hard verse to translate, and Sefaria actually has multiple translations. So when you click on a verse and the side panel opens up, one of the options here is translations, and you can actually select whichever translation you want to look at and have that be your default translation. So you have at the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, which I think is a beautiful opening, and really kind of threads the needle of this. Right? What is this Bereshit bara, which is a weird syntax, but anyway, I just wanted to show people.
Well, it kept Rashi up at night.
Yeah, I'm sure, because that is a complicated one. And again, I think that's, if I don't answer Sefaria's emails on a regular basis anymore, but from what I remember, it was specifically that verse where we got a lot of questions in the beginning, of starting with creating, starting with beginning, right? How exactly to thread that needle was a big question.
Well, that's one of the other goals of this kind of translation, is to make you stop and to make you look at these difficult moments or striking moments and dive deeper than you would otherwise. It's not a text to be read quickly, let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's I think the sort of jolting people that you mentioned at the beginning, which I guess from that perspective, the more emails Sefaria gets about our different translations, I guess the better, right? The more people are noticing things, and that's a good thing overall. So thank you for that. I want to turn to some of our user questions, some of our audience questions from tonight, because we've gotten so many. It's like a constant stream. I don't know, you probably are not watching the comments. I am. So it's alternating between lots of appreciation for the translation and just a tremendous sense of gratitude to you for creating this, and joy that it is available. And then a number of different questions about the translation. Maybe I'll start with a more specific one. This is actually one that came in advance of the event. But the question was about the phrase tohu vavohu. So since we're already in Genesis, that the question was about the phrase appearing only at the beginning of the Torah, only once there, and how you decided how to render a phrase that is where there are words that are unclear in origin or meaning, and how much did your beliefs about what that means, or your beliefs about creation, impact your choices in the translation?
I think, as far as I can tell, that my feelings or beliefs about creation did not enter into it. I could be wrong about that, but my job was to try and reflect what I think the text said. So that's what I was focused on. I wish I could have picked something a little more obscure or something that rhymed. I couldn't solve that one. Maybe I will in the future. I originally had wild and waste, but I decided to change that to confusion and chaos, partly because of later occurrences in the prophets, where Yirmiyahu or Yeshayahu will talk about the world lapsing back into chaos as opposed to lapsing back into wildness or something. So I wanted to keep that connection because the prophets definitely chose those words consciously. But once again, this is something that could change again. But Theodore Gaster, who was a interesting character, a great genius, but very British, once told me that he would translate it as limbo akimbo, which is really great, except to the American ear that sounds silly, but it fulfills all the other requirements, I suppose. Yeah. So now I wish that confusion and chaos, which are a 3-syllable word and a 2-syllable word, they were a little bit more unified. But I'll keep working on it. Some night I'll wake up and maybe I'll have this insight that there's something else that works.
It's interesting. You mentioned a few times allusions to prophets. So we've already gotten several questions about when the full Fox Bible will appear.
That's not an answerable question, but there's half a Bible. So I finished the draft of Isaiah and also working on the Haftarot. So that's keeping me busy. And I've done bits and pieces of Psalms and other things. Yeah.
Wonderful. I don't want to pit one scholar against another. And I already mentioned that most of our authors on Sefaria are no longer living, so this doesn't come up a lot. But there's been a lot of curiosity about how you would compare your translation to that of Professor Alter, and where you see the important similarities, differences, sort of how you see those works complementing each other.
Yeah. Well, Alter is a wonderful reader of the Hebrew. He's very sensitive to the Hebrew. His goal was to try and provide somehow a more elegant English text that would reflect the Hebrew. And sometimes that works, and for me, sometimes that doesn't. So we're different in terms of some of our choices, but we read the Hebrew actually pretty similarly. He hears, many of the same things that I do. He just chooses to. He has a different ear, I guess. He even though he picks up on the Hebrew, but his ear for English is different, and so he's made some different choices than I have, and I don't think he is as fanatical about trying to keep the rhythm as I am. Let's put it that way.
It's good to know what you're passionate about and really embrace it. Another question that I thought was really interesting. How does translation now compare with what Onkelos did in translating the Torah from Hebrew into Aramaic and changing some plain text meanings? And I guess I'll say that just as an addition to that for audience members who might not be familiar. So Onkelos is the sort of classic Aramaic translation of, or if you talk about his translation interpretation,
Sure.
rendering of the Torah text, and the Talmud includes a story about Onkelos doing that translation in a sense that it was a kind of risque kind of measure, maybe in some sense. So, curious how you would put that in context.
Yeah. I mean, the ancient Aramaic translations are in many ways close to Hebrew because the languages are so similar. But they're also, like most translations, ideologically driven. So if I remember, when he talks about God, or maybe this is another Aramaic translation, it doesn't use the term God. It's like Memra, the word of God said to Moses, or the word of God walked in the garden. From that era, there's some squeamishness about referring to God directly or anthropomorphically. So there are things in those kinds of translations that are already moving strongly in an interpretive direction. That is to say, they're reflecting, beliefs and ideas of their authors. Now, we all like to think that we're objective, and that we don't put our own ideas on things. But that, of course, is impossible. But my commitment is to try and understand the text pretty straight, shot oriented, and not to impose other things on it. So, I mean, I think the Aramaic does introduce, sort of pre or rabbinic ideas, which are fine, but that's a different goal. I'm not trying to produce a traditional text in that sense. There are some modern Orthodox translations which actually incorporate these things into the text. So, for instance, an art scroll, it's a wonderful example, the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, they actually give you two translations, one at the bottom of the page, which is literal, and then a kind of rabbinic one up top, which interprets everything allegorically. So it's no longer the body of the man or the woman, but it's the Ten Commandments, it's something else. So that's also an approach, not the one
Right.
that I
So
choose.
I think Art Scrolls like that, the Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs translation of Art Scroll is an extreme
It
um,
is.
example of that in some ways, but we did get the question earlier in deciding how to translate multiple appearances of a word. Do you refer to Talmud and later interpretation to see if later sages felt there were connections among these appearances? So I guess I'd broaden that to ask, like,
Yeah,
is there
I mean, certainly the Midrash picks up on this quite a bit. It's very sensitive to that, and we'll talk about a certain theme, and then they'll very often go in their own direction with that. So one does find that. Do I use those things as resources? I sometimes do, sure, and commentators. That's not necessarily my first resort, but they do figure in. And if you look in the commentary, there are occasional references to some of these folks. So I take their work obviously very seriously, and as people know, they very often anticipated modern discoveries. So some medieval commentator, Ibn Ezra, somebody will say something, and that's corroborated by a tablet found in Iraq, 100 years ago, in another language. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. So a lot of questions about specific word choices, and I don't know. I already asked you about tohu vavohu. Maybe a more generalized version of some of these questions.
Mhm.
Biblical Hebrew has lots of nuances and non-synonyms, but English doesn't like wordiness. How do you weigh precision against wordiness? And again, I guess some of the follow-up questions here are about, again, this question of translating the
Yeah.
same word the same or differently. Different time, specifically a question of how you would translate the word mizbeach. So anything you want to say about the wordiness
Mhm.
versus precision question?
Yeah, biblical Hebrew is notoriously laconic. It's very brief. Sometimes something that's 3 words in Hebrew will be 7 words in English. And so I try and pay attention to that. And if I can cut it down, I certainly will. Um, that's an important principle. Sometimes it's not possible, quite simply. As far as Mizbeach goes, that's one of the big changes in recent years, and that comes from discussions with a scholar friend of mine who's a Ugaritic scholar, and he points out that Zavach is not only one thing, but in Ugaritic pretty common, and does not necessarily mean a place of slaughter, but means a place of sacrifice. In other words, it's not so much the killing part as a sacrificial feast, and so and also responding to readers over many years, some of whom were a little shocked or disturbed or alerted by this idea of slaughter site. It started to feel like it was getting in the way. And so to go back to the usual altar, which is not the same thing exactly, but it's the conventional one. It doesn't interfere with the text as much, and I think it's closer to what they meant. After all, one of the things that is sacrificed is grain. And so, to my knowledge, one does not slaughter grain. So there you go. But what I was loath to leave slaughter site, but that's one of the cases of many where the word choices by Buber and Rosenzweig reflected their own time and their understanding. But over time, I've really gotten away from that. So I'm no longer trying to reproduce their work. I do refer to it, but that's not the main goal right now. Their way of reading, yes, and that's still very much there.
Thank you. There's a few other sort of specific questions about changes that you made to this site, and I think we're almost at time. So this may be our last question. But you referenced in passing earlier that one of the advantages of having this text on Sefaria is that you can email. I think you mentioned Lev. So Lev
Right.
is a colleague of mine at Sefaria, chief data officer, and he is able to work his engineering magic and go in on the back end and make a change.
Right.
If you sort of wake up one morning and decide, well, actually, this word should be rendered differently, can you give us an example of a moment where that happened, or a word where you did decide to make that change?
I'm trying to think of another example. Well, I mean, again, tohu avohu, confusion and chaos, and alter. I'm sure I'll think of 20 examples after we're finished. But
Well, I guess one of the specific questions was about the revised edition, that words like war and battle have been changed.
yeah, I moved to battle because it seemed to fit everything better. Nothing terribly earth-shaking. It just worked in more passages than war did. I have nothing against war. Actually, I have a lot against war, but as a word, battle seemed to fit the occurrences better. Let's put it that way. To wage battle, to engage in battle. That's basically what I did.
Wonderful. I guess it'd be interesting to go through, right, and see all the times where you changed, or if you
Well,
saw.
yeah. I mean, what I often do is I put on an index card, the 20 passages where something appears, and then I'll try something out. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's an imperfect science in that sense, and one goes back and maybe lets the whole thing rest for a couple of months and then comes back, and it's very analogous to, once again, what happens with musical performance. You see something you didn't see before, even if you've studied it or performed it for years. Something pops out at you. As I often tell students, if you read the Akedah, if you're a teenager, your sympathies are in one direction, and if you're 40 or 50, same story, but you're not focusing so much the way you did before. Now it's all from a parent's perspective.
Right.
So that's what happens.
Well, since you mentioned a musical performance once more, last question. Someone did ask about the significance of Brahms, which is behind you, and
That's
since
true.
musical
That's
performance,
true.
want to give us a last thought about translation as performance before we
Well,
wrap.
I mean, I think about music a lot because that's my background, and I also see a lot of similarities in terms of structure and how something holds together, and also how performance can change over time. So I think the translator has to be open to change and open to change in how you perceive the text. Rosenzweig says you never know what passage is going to leap out at you at any given moment in your life. So you have to be open, and of course we have this experience. We're about to experience it again. we're going to finish the Torah and then we're going to start it all over again. Well, what could be new? And the answer is everything, because you're not who you were last year. And so that's
That
why for teachers and students, this kind of approach on Sefaria is really important.
That's, I think, as ringing an endorsement as any of trying to get everyone to sign on right away and experience your translation if they haven't yet. So it's an inspiring way to go into this next Torah reading cycle. Professor Fox, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for allowing your translation to be available on Sefaria and to all of Sefaria's users. We're really so excited that we were able to have this conversation and have this Q&A with you. Thank you.
Okay, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. And thank you all so much for coming. The recording will be sent out. And just to let you all know that, as you may already, Sefaria is a nonprofit organization. We rely entirely on the generosity of individuals and foundations to power the library and the amazing learning events like this one. Right now, we've set a goal to raise $250,000 this high holiday season. And with just 4 days left to go, because the holidays are coming to an end, we have just $10,000 left to raise. If you feel like you've benefited from this event today, or from any aspect of the library this year, I really hope that you'll consider donating to help us get to our goal. Every dollar that you contribute is reinvested directly into your learning experience at Sefaria, and we're proud to continue adding new texts and new translations to the library. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.